The rope bit into the skin of her wrist, raw and red against the bone. It was a cheap rope, frayed and stiff with dust, and it tethered her to the splintered side of her father's wagon like she was livestock, which, she supposed, was what she had become. The sun was a hammer in a brass sky, beating down on the single, sorry street of the settlement, cooking the smell of dust and despair from the ground. People watched. They stared from the deep shade of the general store's porch, their faces flat and curious, a few whispering behind their hands. Her father's voice, thick with whiskey and desperation, sawed at the air. He was a big man made small, his shoulders slumped, his words a slurry of grievance. He gestured to her with a sweeping, unsteady hand. He spoke of her barrenness as if it were a sickness she had cultivated out of spite, a personal failing aimed squarely at him. She had heard the words so many times they no longer stung. They were just a sound, like the buzzing of flies on a dead thing. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose nail in a floorboard across the way. She did not look at the faces in the crowd. She did not look at the men her father tried to barter with, hard-faced men with mean little eyes who looked her over, then shook their heads and spat. She was a bad trade, worn out, empty. She felt herself shrink inside her own skin, becoming something small and dense and hard, something that could not be broken further because it was already just a stone. The dust lifted in little eddies, like ghosts rising and falling. The heat shimmered over the packed earth. She felt a tremor in the rope and knew her father was leaning against the wagon, his brief burst of energy spent. The silence that followed was worse than his shouting. It was a heavy, judging silence, filled with the town's verdict. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom of the livery stable. He was a tall man, built lean like a fence rail, and he moved with a quiet that didn't belong to this noisy, graceless place. He wore a coat the color of the dust, and his face was all angles and planes, as if carved from weathered wood. His eyes, dark and deep-set, rested on her, but there was no judgment in them. There was nothing in them at all, just a great and terrible stillness. He carried whole winters in his eyes. She'd seen him before on the edge of town, a man who lived apart, whose blood was a quiet mix of two peoples and welcome by neither. He was just a shape in the landscape, a part of the loneliness. Her father, seeing a new audience, roused himself. He'd found a new mark, a freighter with a belly that strained the buttons of his shirt, and a laugh like rocks grinding together. The freighter grinned, showing brown teeth, and took a step toward her. He reached out a thick-fingered hand as if to test the goods. Before the man's fingers could touch her dress, the quiet man from the livery moved. He didn't hurry. He just stepped into the space between them. He looked at her father, then at the grimy collection of coins on the wagon seat her father had been trying to trade for. He reached into his own pocket, his movements deliberate, and placed 3 silver coins on an overturned barrel. The sound was small but cut through the heat. They shone, clean and bright, against the wood. He didn't look at her. He spoke to her father, his voice low and steady, a voice that sounded like it came from under floorboards. "I'll take her." Her father blinked, swaying. He squinted at the coins, then at the man. Greed and confusion warred in his bleary eyes. The freighter grunted and stepped back, losing interest. The deal was done. Her father scooped up the coins, his fingers fumbling. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even look at her again. He just untied the rope from the wagon, his back to her, and handed the end of it to the quiet man. The man's hand closed around the rope, but his eyes were on hers. He held her gaze for a single, long moment. Then he drew a small, sharp knife from his belt. Not with a threat, but with a simple, practical motion. He didn't untie the knot at her wrist. He laid the rope against the wagon wheel and sliced cleanly through it. The tension snapped. Her hand fell free to her side, tingling with a sudden rush of blood. The cut end of the rope lay in the dust, a dead snake. He turned and started walking. He didn't speak a word to her, didn't beckon. He just walked away from the town, his back straight, his stride even. After a moment of paralyzed stillness, a moment where the world seemed to hold its breath, she followed. Her bare feet made no sound in the thick dust. She was a shadow following a shadow, leaving the noise and the stares and the name she used to have behind. The journey was a long, silent procession. The man walked ahead, his pace measured, never so fast that she fell too far behind. The sun beat down, and the land stretched out around them, vast and empty, a canvas of cracked earth and pale, thirsty scrub. The wind was a constant, dry whisper against her skin, pulling at the threads of her thin dress. He did not look back. He seemed to be listening to the land itself, a part of its harsh and patient rhythm. Hours passed. The sun slid down the western sky, painting the clouds in brutal shades of orange and purple. Her throat was a knot of dust. Her legs ached with a deep, hollow fatigue. Just when she thought she might fall, he stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and held it out to her, his arm extended back without turning his body. She hesitated. It was the first gesture of any kind he had made toward her. Her hand trembled as she took it. The water was warm, metallic, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank, then handed it back. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second, a touch as brief and impersonal as falling rain. Then they walked on. Dusk was settling, blurring the edges of the world into soft gray, when they arrived. His home was not a cabin so much as a collection of stones and timbers pulled from the earth and willed into a shelter. It stood alone against a low mesa, weathered and solitary, looking as if it had grown there. A thin curl of smoke was already rising from its stone chimney, though she could not imagine how. Beside the small house was a single, low mound of stones, a grave, marked with one smooth, pale rock that caught the last of the light. He pushed the door open. It didn't creak. Inside, it was dark and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. A fire glowed in a wide stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. The space was sparse, almost bare. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a bed of pine and rope in one corner. There was a small, alcove-like room off the main one, containing nothing but a narrow cot with a folded blanket on it. He gestured toward it with his chin. That was for her. He didn't speak. He moved to the hearth and ladled a thick, dark stew into 2 wooden bowls. He set one on the table for himself and the other on the floor just outside the doorway of her small room. Then he sat down at the table, his back to her, and began to eat. The message was clear, an unspoken contract. Here is food. Here is shelter. This space is yours. You are safe from me. She crept to the bowl, her body still coiled tight with years of caution. She took it back into her alcove and ate, the warmth spreading through her, a strange and unfamiliar comfort. That night, she heard him bank the fire and settle not in the bed, but in a nest of blankets on the hearthstones, placing himself between her and the door, between her and the entire world. The house was quiet, but for the first time in a very long time, the silence was not empty. It was waiting. The days fell into a pattern, a quiet rhythm set by the sun and the needs of survival. They rose in the gray pre-dawn light. He would already have the fire going, its soft crackle the only sound in the house. There was never any talk. He would leave for the day, heading out into the scrubland with his rifle or his tools, and she would remain at the house. At first, she did nothing, only sat on her cot, a ghost in a borrowed room. The silence of the place was so profound it felt like a presence. It seeped into the cracks in the walls, into the grain of the wood, into her. But the stillness of idleness began to feel heavier than the stillness of peace. One morning, she found a broom made of bound twigs by the door. She swept the packed earth floor, her movements stiff and unpracticed. She gathered the dust and ash into a small pile and carried it outside. It was a small thing, but it was a thing. When he returned at dusk, he didn't comment, but she saw his eyes flicker to the clean-swept floor as he set down a brace of rabbits. Another day, she took the worn, threadbare blanket from her cot and found a needle and a spool of coarse thread in a small wooden box on the mantel. She sat in the sliver of sunlight that fell through the single window and mended the holes, her stitches small and even. She stitched their lives together with that raw thread, his and hers, in that quiet room. He worked on the fence that bordered his small plot of land, resetting posts loosened by the wind, splicing wire with calloused, competent hands. She watched him from the doorway, a distant figure moving against the vast, indifferent landscape. He moved with an economy of motion, a strength that was calm and contained. One afternoon, driven by a strange impulse, she walked to the low mound of stones beside the house. She knelt and pulled a few stubborn weeds that grew between the rocks. She looked around, at the sparse, hardy landscape, and saw a single tough little wildflower, a spot of defiant purple in the endless brown. She picked it and laid it gently on the flat, pale stone that served as a marker. She didn't know who was buried there, but she knew what loss felt like. When she turned, he was standing by the corner of the house, watching her. He had come back for something, and he had seen. His face was unreadable, a mask of sun-browned skin and shadow. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away. The offerings became a silent conversation. She would leave his bowl of stew on the table instead of the floor. He, in turn, left a thick woolen shawl on her cot one evening when the wind turned mean and bit with the first hint of autumn cold. It was old and smelled of him, of wood smoke and dry earth, and she wrapped it around her shoulders, the warmth of physical kindness. She began to cook. The first loaf of bread she baked in the small stone oven was a disaster. It was hard as a rock, burned on the bottom and raw in the middle. She was about to throw it out in shame when he came in. He picked it up, hefted it in his hand, and broke a piece off with a crack. He chewed it thoughtfully. "A little dry," he said. It was the first time he had spoken to her in what felt like weeks. Her cheeks burned. She looked at the floor. "You didn't complain about mine," he added, his voice low. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth for a second, then vanished. He ate the entire piece. "That loaf died in vain," she heard herself whisper, the words rusty in her throat. He almost laughed. It was a rough, quiet sound, like stones shifting. The tension in the room didn't break, but it changed, becoming something softer, more pliable. One night, a scream tore her from sleep, her own. A phantom hand was on her throat, the smell of whiskey sharp in her nose. She sat bolt upright on the cot, gasping, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The room was black, utterly black. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. The door. Was it locked? Was she trapped? She scrambled from the cot, stumbling toward where she thought the door was, her hands outstretched in the suffocating darkness. She ran right into him. He was just standing there, a solid, unmoving shape in the black. She flinched back with a cry, expecting a blow. But he didn't move. He didn't touch her. "The door doesn't lock," he said, his voice calm and steady in the dark. "Never has." He stepped aside, and she felt the cooler air from the main room. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but he knelt and added a few small pieces of kindling. A tiny flame flickered, then caught, pushing the hungry darkness back. The light washed over her, and she stood there, trembling, wrapped in the woolen shawl, her fear laid bare. She sank down onto the floor by the hearth, drawing her knees to her chest. He sat on his heels across the fire from her, watching the flames. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling between them, a small, warm world in the vast, cold night. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice thin as a thread. "Why did you take me?" He stared into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "My wife," he began, his voice rough. "She was from a village south of here. Her people. They did not cast out their own," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "She would not have liked to see a woman left tied to a wagon." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and clear. "It was not for you. It was for her." The words should have hurt. They should have made her feel like a stand-in, a ghost honoring another ghost. But they didn't. They were honest. They were clean. It was an act born of love for someone else, which made it pure. It had nothing to do with wanting something from her. It was a debt he was paying to a memory. And, he added, his voice dropping even lower, I don't hold with a man who names his own daughter worthless. She looked down at her hands, at the cracked skin and the dirt beneath her nails. They were her hands. They had mended and swept and cooked. They were not worthless. A single tear, hot and surprising, slid down her cheek and fell onto the dusty floorboards. He pretended not to see it. He just kept his vigil, feeding the fire, until the sky outside began to pale with the promise of morning. The house breathed around them, and for the first time, it breathed with her. The first sign of the past's return was a disturbance on the horizon. A smudge of dust that didn't belong. For weeks, the world had been only them, the house, and the vast empty land. That plume of dust was an intrusion, a violation of the quiet pact they had made with the wilderness. Cale saw it first. He was on the roof, replacing a loose section of sod, when his body went still. She was hanging laundry on a rope line strung between the house and a gnarled juniper. A shirt of his, her own mended dress, and she felt the change in the air before she saw the cause. His stillness was an alarm. She followed his gaze to the east. The dust cloud was growing, resolving itself into the shapes of two riders. They were moving at a steady pace, heading directly for the small homestead. A cold knot formed in her stomach, a familiar dread she had thought was buried. She knew with a certainty that went bone deep who it was. Cale climbed down from the roof without a word, his movements fluid and unhurried. He went inside the house. She stood frozen by the clothesline, her hand still clutching a wooden pin. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Cale emerged a moment later. He carried his rifle, but he held it loosely, pointed toward the ground. It wasn't a threat, not yet. It was a statement. This ground was his. He stopped beside her. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the solid presence of him, a rock in the shifting tide of her fear. Go inside, he said, his voice low and even. She shook her head, a small, sharp movement. No, the word came out stronger than she expected. He glanced at her then, a quick, assessing look. He saw the set of her jaw, the refusal in her eyes. He gave another of his almost nods and turned back to face the approaching riders. They would meet this together. It took another 10 minutes for the riders to reach the edge of his property. Her father was in the lead. He looked different, sober, clean-shaven. He wore a determined, self-righteous expression that was somehow more menacing than his drunken despair. Beside him rode the marshal from the settlement, a man with a tin star on his vest and an uncomfortable look on his face. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the house, turning the land into a battleground. Cale, the marshal said, his voice carrying on the wind. We've come for the girl. Her father spoke then, his voice loud and proprietary. I've come for my daughter. You stole her. Cale didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. There was a transaction. You took the silver. A man can't sell his own kin, her father blustered, his face turning red. It's not legal. She's my blood. She belongs with me. He said the words my blood, as if they were a brand of ownership. He was no longer a man discarding a useless object. He was a man reclaiming what was his pride stinging from the memory of his own weakness. She is not property, Cale said. The words were simple, flat, and unarguable. He took one step forward, planting himself more firmly between them and her. It was a small movement, but it was everything. He was a shield. He was a wall. The marshal shifted in his saddle. Now, Cale, the law is a complicated thing. But her father wasn't interested in the law. He was interested in possession. His eyes, burning with a new kind of fire, fixed on her. You, get your things. We're leaving. It was an order, the same tone he had used her whole life. For a moment, the old fear rose up, thick and choking. The instinct to obey, to cower, was a current that had run through her for years. She felt her muscles tense, her breath catch. She looked at her father's face, at the righteous anger that was just another mask for his own shame. Then she looked at the back of the man standing in front of her. The worn, dust-colored coat, the straightness of his spine, the quiet, unyielding strength that had given her space to breathe. She took a step forward, out from behind his shadow, so she stood beside him. The movement drew all their eyes. Her father's face hardened. The marshal looked surprised. Cale didn't flinch. She looked directly at her father. She let him see her, not the cowed, silent creature he had sold, but the woman who stood here now. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as shattered glass.
No.
The single word hung in the air, immense. It was a refusal. It was a reclamation. It was the sound of a lock breaking. Her father's face twisted in disbelief, then rage. He swung himself down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. "You will do as you are told," he snarled, taking a step toward her. Cale raised the rifle then, not to his shoulder, but just enough so the barrel was level. That's far enough. But it was her own action that stopped him. As her father lunged, she didn't shrink back. She stood her ground. She raised her chin, and her hand, the one that had been holding the clothespin, balled into a fist. She didn't strike him. She didn't need to. The defiance in her posture, the fire in her eyes, the absolute finality of her no. It was a blow he couldn't withstand. He stopped, his lunge faltering, stunned into silence by this stranger who wore his daughter's face. The marshal held up a hand. "That's enough, both of you." He looked from her father's sputtering rage to Cale's immovable calm, and then to her. He didn't see a captive anymore. He saw a woman who had made a choice. "It appears the lady has made her position clear," he said, his tone dry. "There's nothing for the law to do here. This is a family matter. And she's chosen her family." He turned his horse, giving her father a hard look. "Let's go. There's nothing for you here." Defeated, not by force but by a will he could no longer break, her father stared at her one last time. He saw nothing of himself left in her eyes. He turned without another word, climbed heavily back onto his horse, and rode away. He didn't look back. The marshal gave a curt nod toward Cale, then followed, the two of them becoming shrinking shapes in the dust until they were gone. The silence they left behind was vast and clean. The wind sighed through the juniper, and the shirt on the line flapped gently. Her body began to tremble, a reaction to the fear she had held at bay. Cale lowered the rifle. He turned to her, and his eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't name. He saw the tremor in her hands, the strength that was now draining away, leaving her exhausted. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply looked at her, a deep and knowing look that saw all the way to the core of her. "You were brave," he said softly. She nodded, unable to speak. He was right. She had been. She looked at the small house of stone and wood, at the empty land that was no longer empty. She looked at him, and she knew she was home. The confrontation did not end their silence, but it changed the quality of it. It was no longer the silence of strangers sharing a space, but the deep, resting quiet of two people who had stood together and held their ground. The unspoken contract of shelter and food was fulfilled. Something new was being written in its place. The house felt different. It had been a refuge. Now it was a fortress. That evening they sat by the fire, the way they had after her nightmare. But this time, there was no fear between them, only a shared exhaustion and a profound, bone-deep peace. The firelight flickered on his weathered face, softening the hard lines. He had been turning a small piece of wood over in his hands, carving at it slowly with his knife. He stopped his work and looked at her, his gaze steady. "You need a name," he said. It wasn't a question. He knew her father had taken her old one, stripped it of all meaning until it was just another sound of her subjugation. He wasn't asking for it. He was offering a new one. She waited. She had no name to give him, and the one he chose would be the one she would become. "Lena," he said, the word soft in the quiet room. It means light, the light that comes after a long dark. Lena. She tried the name out in the quiet of her own mind. It felt strange and new, a clean garment to replace her rags. It was a name given not by birth or by law, but by seeing. He had seen the flicker of strength in her and named it. She nodded slowly. Lena, she repeated, her own voice giving it life. It was the first time she had introduced herself in this new world. The act was a quiet ceremony. He had not claimed her, he had named her. He had given her not an identity tied to him, but one that was her own. With that single word, he burned away the last vestiges of the woman who had been tied to a wagon. A symbolic fire, and in the ash, something new was waiting. The next day, she took the tattered dress she had arrived in, the one that held the dust and the memory of her humiliation. She folded it neatly and placed it in the hearth. She didn't need to ask. When Cale came in, he saw it lying there. He understood. He laid a log on the fire, and together, they watched the worn fabric curl, blacken, and turn to ash. It was a funeral for a life she no longer lived. Life settled back into its rhythm, but the beat was different. It was the rhythm of a partnership. They moved around the small house with an easy grace, a knowledge of each other's space and habits. He would find she had reinforced the stitching on his coat. She would find a new, sturdier handle carved for the water bucket. These were their conversations, their affections, spoken in the language of wood and thread. One evening, a month later, as the first snows were beginning to dust the high mesas, he spoke again of marriage. Not with romance, but with the same quiet practicality he did everything else. The marshal will not come back, he said, staring into the fire. But others might. A piece of paper from a judge. Keeps folks from asking questions they've no right to ask. He looked at her. It would make you safe. She knew what he was offering. Not a cage, but a lock on the door of their fortress, a lock only they held the key to. A way to tell the world they were a single unit, indivisible. Yes, she said. The final image was not of a ceremony or a declaration. Came seasons later. The harshness of the land had not softened, but they had grown to fit it. She was sitting on the small porch he had built, her hands shelling beans into a wooden bowl. Cale was a few feet away, mending a piece of harness, his hands sure and steady. A child, a small boy with Cale's quiet eyes and her own resilient spirit, toddled between them, a clumsy, joyful link. The sun was setting, bathing the world in a soft, golden light. The house behind them was no longer a hollow shelter, but a place that breathed with their life, its windows like warm eyes. Lena looked at Cale and he looked back at her. No words were needed. The silence was full of everything they had built together. Not with grand gestures, but with small daily acts of care, with shared work, with the profound and unspoken kindness of standing together against the storm. The fire inside was lit, and it would keep them warm through all the winters to come. So you see, this story, it ain't just about a rescue. Any man with a strong arm can pull a body from the water. This is about what happens after. It's about the quiet patience it takes to let a soul dry out on its own terms, in its own time. It's about understanding that healing isn't a thing you do to someone. It's a space you hold for them. A warm room, a bowl of soup left by the door, an unlocked door. Sometimes love ain't a firework. Sometimes it's just the slow, steady banking of a fire on a cold night. It's the unspoken promise to stand between someone and the ghosts of their past until they're strong enough to face them on their own. And a name. A name is the most powerful gift of all. It's to look at someone the world has called worthless and see the light in them. To see them not for what they were, but for what they could become. So here's your naming. For every one of you who's ever felt discarded, ever felt tethered to a past you didn't choose, there is a strength in you the world has not yet seen. And if you're brave enough to answer its call, if you're brave enough to say that one small word, no, to the life that is breaking you, you might just find something new waiting in the quiet. You might find that the harshest landscapes grow the most resilient things. You might just find a home,